a death before the bells. Yet no one heard a thing. Welcome to Mystery Parlor. I am your host, Axon. Share where you're joining us from. I love seeing this community connect. Your presence means everything. Now, let's begin. Flaxborough liked its mornings to behave. Not in any preached or militant way. Flaxborough was far too polite for that. But in the steady, habitual way, a market town expects its clocks to agree with one another and its citizens to remain more or less where they were left the night before. Deliveries arrived at the same back doors. Dogs performed the same private inspections of lamp posts. Notices were pinned to the same boards in the same handwriting. If anything had a right to be called sacred in Flaxborough, it was the fact that the day should start as yesterday had. On a Tuesday in late March, the town stood a chance of succeeding. A grey brightness, like a watered-down promise, spread itself over Sheep Market Street, touching the shop windows and the cobbles without much conviction. A wisp of cold came in from the river, and the river, for its part, pretended not to notice. Mrs. Vine, sweeping her step outside Vine's haberdashery, paused to stare at the sky with the practiced suspicion of a woman who had been betrayed by weather before. Across the road, Mr. Priddy opened his butcher's shutters in a manner suggesting he was doing the town a personal favor. The shutters clapped twice, a familiar percussion that generally meant the rest of the world could now proceed. The morning's principal event, and therefore the town's principal conversation, was to be the rehearsal of the church bells. St. Hilda's stood right off the square, a fat-shouldered church whose stone had acquired the color of old tea. The bell rehearsal was no great affair to outsiders. To Flaxborough it was an audible marker in the week, an announcement that time was behaving properly. It belonged to the bell-ringers' guild, which belonged to the vicar, which belonged to a sort of tradition that nobody could quite explain, but everyone felt was likely to collapse if unattended. A rehearsal meant the town's heart was still beating in the right place. At 10:15 sharp, the bells were due to begin. At 10:12, Miss Dora Fankle lay dead in the vestibules of the church. She was not, strictly speaking, meant to be there. Miss Fankle was the kind of woman who was where she was meant to be, almost pathologically. She had served, with a resigned briskness, as secretary to the Flaxborough Ladies' Civic Improvement Society. She had not married, though she had once liked to say, with a thin little laugh, that the decision wasn't wholly hers. Dora had attended St. Hilda's every Sunday without fail, and on weekdays went only if summoned by duty. Flower arranging, bazaar setting, the quietly ceaseless correction of other people's punctuation on public notices. She had never, in living memory, arrived early for anything, unless it required chairs. But that morning she had come to St. Hilda's before the bell rehearsal, carrying a narrow folder under her arm and wearing her good navy coat, as if the day were interesting. There are a number of ways to die, of course. In market towns, these are often doomed to remain private, because air carries so far, and because people with gardens and obligations prefer not to upset their roses. Miss Fankle's way was peculiar enough to qualify as a story and subdued enough to qualify as a Flaxborough story. She had collapsed on the stone tiles just inside the inner door. Her hat was still on. Her folder had slipped from her arm and lay open, papers spread like startled birds. Her handbag sat beside her with its clasp fastened. There was no mess to speak of, no drama. She looked, if anything, as if she had lain down for a moment to listen to something. The first person to see her was Mr. Lionel Spatchcock, churchwarden and amateur carpenter, who had come early to wedge the west door against a draught he disliked on principle. Lionel was a thorough man with a modest face and a wandering certainty about his own importance. He arrived by the side alley, jingled the church keys in a way that said he expected the building to admire them, and entered humming half a hymn in no particular key. He saw Dora. He stopped humming. There is a very particular kind of horror reserved for people who manage institutions. Not the horror that someone has died, but that they have died in one's institution, improperly, and without consultation. Lionel stood perfectly still for 3 full seconds, during which his mind performed a rapid inventory of possible causes and possible blame. Then he advanced, slowly, with the small, frightened reverence of a man approaching a toppled lectern. "Miss Fankle," he said, as if a reply might excuse him from the rest. She did not reply. Lionel knelt. It was a miserable business, since he had not knelt, as far as anyone could recall, since a Harvest Festival photo in 1961. He touched her shoulder, lightly, because vigorous contact in Flaxborough was generally seen as vulgar. She was cold enough to be unmistakable. Lionel rose, glanced around the empty nave, and did what everyone in Flaxborough did when the world misbehaved. He looked for somebody else to tell. He hurried back out into the square, shutting the door behind him with a care that seemed, at the time, to him entirely appropriate. The town was still in its morning rhythm. A bicycle bell tinkled, a lorry hissed at the curb. Mrs. Vine was sweeping too energetically in a way that suggested she already knew something the rest of the street did not. Lionel crossed to the post office, because the post office was where you went for emergencies as well as stamps. Mrs. Hatch, the postmistress, was in the act of sorting parcels with the controlled rage of a woman who had never forgiven modern packaging. She looked up when Lionel burst in. "Whatever is the matter?" she said, not unkindly, but with an undertone of pleased alarm. Lionel, to his own irritation, found that his voice did not behave. "It's Dora," he managed. "Miss Fankle. She's in the church. She's not. She's dead." Mrs. Hatch did not immediately understand this. Like most people who were useful, she had trained herself not to accept news until it arrived properly. She blinked twice, then set down a parcel and wiped her hands on her apron as if washing away the thought. "Dead?" she repeated with bewildered emphasis. "In the church?" Lionel nodded, feeling that nodding was now an official act. Mrs. Hatch leaned in slightly, like someone taking in the scent of smoke. Her eyes moved past Lionel to the square as if she expected Dora to come briskly down it with her folder, annoyed at the fuss. "Are you sure?" she said. "Perhaps she's fainted. She's had those turns over the years." "She's cold," Lionel said. It came out more sharply than he intended, and he wished at once he had phrased it less definitively. Coldness in Flaxborough was not, socially speaking, a conclusive proof of anything. Mrs. Hatch drew a breath that was half gasp, half inhale of a new responsibility. "Well," she said, and the word carried several meanings at once. Shock, decision, and a mild reproach to the universe for such inconvenience. "We must ring the police. You'll need to go back and lock the door. People will be coming, they always do." "Lock the door?" Lionel repeated faintly, picturing a whole class of people who would be irked at being kept out of their own church. But he knew she was right. There were people who saw access to tragedy as a kind of civic entitlement. Mrs. Hatch picked up the telephone with the precision of a woman beginning a task she had always known she might one day need to do. She dialed the number for the police station without consulting the directory, because every town of sense keeps such numbers close. Inspector Purbright was not yet involved, not yet visible in the morning, but in the quiet, orderly rooms of Flaxborough Police Station, he had already lifted his head from paperwork as if some distant thread had been tugged. He was in his office with a cup of tea that had gone politely cool. The tea had been made by Sergeant Lovejoy, who made it as he did all other things, dutifully, without imagination, and to the exact degree of strength the inspector neither wanted nor complained about. Purbright was reading a report about a missing greenhouse pane on Humbert Close. He was not convinced the pane had gone missing so much as broken in the night and frightened the residents into grammatical drama. Still, the paper had to be read. The people of Humbert Close expected it. The telephone on the outer desk rang. Sergeant Lovejoy answered. There was a pause in which the sergeant's posture stiffened by 2 respectable inches. Then he came into Purbright's office with the receiver covered by his hand. "Inspector," Lovejoy said, in the tone of a man announcing a change in the weather. "There's been a death at St. Hilda's. Churchwarden found Miss Dora Fankle by the west door. They say she's dead." Purbright did not move quickly. He didn't need to. The dead were unlikely to go anywhere, and the living in Flaxbar were unlikely to do anything sensible without being asked. "By the west door?" he repeated softly. "Yes, sir. Found about 10 minutes ago. Mrs. Hatch on the line." Purbright set down the report, flattening its corner with a thumb as if to keep it from escaping. His face was patient, puzzled, and not in the least theatrical. In another town, another sort of policeman might have felt a sharpening of excitement, a sense that the day had improved. In Purbright, there was only the steady accommodation of one more human complication. "Tell Mrs. Hatch we'll be there directly," he said, "and ask Sergeant Kitty to come with me. We'll want the doctor too. Dr. Hurst if he's in." "Yes, sir." As Lovejoy turned, Purbright's eyes drifted to the window. The square was visible in part from where he sat. Folk moving with their parcels, their bicycles, their souls held carefully upright. The bells were due to ring in 3 minutes, and the town didn't yet know it had already lost its measure. Purbright picked up his hat. "Poor Dora," he said, not aloud, but in a small internal voice that had known many Doras. Then he glanced once more at the report about the greenhouse pane and added a thought that was almost a sigh. "Flaxborough can scarcely manage broken glass. It will do surface hysteria over a dead woman." He walked out calmly into the corridor, and the morning, which had been so determined to behave, began to slip, quietly, from its proper script. Purbright and Sergeant Kitty reached St. Hilda's at 10:21, by which time the west door had acquired the dignity of a closed mouth. Lionel Spatchcock stood outside it with the keys in his fist. The square behind him was already thickening with slow-moving curiosity. People were drifting in from side streets on errands that had suddenly become non-urgent, pausing to examine shop windows they had never admired yesterday. "Inspector," Lionel said, "thank you for coming." "You found Miss Fankle?" Purbright asked. Lionel nodded and unlocked the door, fussing with the chain. The vestibule was cool, smelling of damp stone and wilting lilies. Dora lay where he had left her, neatly skewed as if she had started to sit and changed her mind too late. Her hat remained on. Her folder had sprung open. Papers were spread in a mild fan about her hand. Purbright stopped just inside, taking the scene in without the hurry that would have been wasted on her now. Dr. Hurst arrived within minutes, breathless but brisk. He knelt beside Dora with practiced economy, checked her pulse, her pupils, and the temperature of her skin. "She's been dead a while," he said, looking up. "An hour, maybe more. Hard to judge in here." "Any sign of injury?" Kitty asked. "No blood, no bruising I can see. She may have had a heart attack." He lifted Dora's collar, then let it settle. "If so, it was quick. There's no real distress in the face." Purbright crouched, not to touch her, but to look at the papers. The top sheet was typed, "Ladies' Civic Improvement Society, Emergency Subcommittee." Dora's pencil notes in the margin were precise and faintly indignant. Beneath it lay a torn map of the town centre with a rectangle drawn around the old railway goods yard. Another page listed names under the heading, "Present Apologies." Kitty hovered near Dora's handbag. "Open it, sir?" "In a moment," Purbright said. To Lionel he added, "Did you move anything?" "No, sir. I only touched her shoulder. Then I went straight to Mrs. Hatch. She told me to lock up before folk charged in." "Good sense," Purbright said, and Lionel breathed out. "She was here early on purpose," Lionel went on. "Yesterday she said she had something to put right before the rehearsal. She was quite sharp about it." "Put right?" Purbright echoed. "Yes. She said, 'I'll sort out that nonsense before everyone starts in with the bells.' I thought it was about the ropes again." Purbright let that sit. "Were any ringers here when you came in?" "No, I didn't hear a soul. I'd come early for that draft by the west door." The bells never rang, Kitty said, more to himself than anyone. The square murmured on the other side of the wall. Purbright straightened. "Sergeant, keep the church closed. Ask everyone to wait by the lich gate." Kitty went out. Purbright remained in the vestibule with Lionel and the doctor. "Doctor, I'd be obliged if you arranged for her to be taken to the surgery." Quietly. "I'll call an ambulance round the alley," Dr. Hurst said. "We'll keep it discreet." He packed his bag and left. Only then did Purbright open Dora's handbag. Inside were a folded handkerchief, a tin of peppermints, a pill bottle bearing Dr. Hurst's label, and a thick cream envelope addressed to Mr. R.M. Teagle, town clerk. The bottle was empty. Purbright noted that and put it back. The envelope was sealed. He eased it open with a thumbnail, drew out a letter, and read it in silence. For a moment, his mouth developed the smallest notch of dry amusement. "What is it, sir?" Lionel asked. "A draft complaint," Purbright said gently. "Miss Fankel was writing to the town clerk about the goods yard redevelopment. She believed something irregular was being done there and wanted an emergency meeting this evening." "The goods yard?" Lionel blinked. "That council scheme?" "Exactly." Purbright slid the letter back into its envelope and tapped the marked map. "It takes quite a lot to stir Miss Fankel into emergency." Kitty returned, lowering his voice. "Squares contained, sir. What now?" "Tell Lovejoy to find out who knew Dora intended to come here early. I want to see Mr. Teagle and the councillor in charge of the yard project. Also the bell ringers. If anyone arrived, they may have left unseen." Kitty nodded and went again. Purbright took out his notebook and wrote a few lines while Lionel watched, hands clasped. Everything was in its usual place except Dora herself. Yet Purbright's eye was caught by a faint metallic smudge on the inner door above the latch, pale against old brass. It looked fresh, as if a ring or key had scraped it in haste. Outside, a bell ringer's bicycle leaned against the railings, front wheels still turning in slow embarrassment. Purbright noticed it through the open inner door and asked Lionel, "Whose is that?" Lionel peered. "That'll be Mr. Haxby's. He's always early, but if he came, he must have gone in by the tower steps. I never saw him leave." Purbright thanked him, and Lionel, grateful for a task, went to fetch a chair and returned with it as though it might be required for Dora. The inspector declined the seat and wandered a step or two into the nave. Sunlight, thin as tracing paper, lay on the pew ends. From the tower stairwell came the faint smell of machine oil and old rope. He paused by the notice board. A new poster for the goods yard consultation evening had been pinned there, its corners arranged with civic optimism. Someone had torn off the bottom strip of phone numbers. The tear was recent. He was still looking at it when footsteps came softly down the aisle. Purbright waited, his expression unreadable. The steps belonged to Mrs. Nesta Barch, who carried the air of a woman summoned by destiny and mildly insulted by it. She did not speak at once. Her gaze went past Purbright to the vestibule, and her fingers rose to the little silver cross at her throat. "Oh," she said at last. "It's true, then?" Purbright inclined his head. "I'm afraid so. You are Mrs. Barch?" "Choir mistress. Nesta Barch. I came to see why the rehearsal was delayed. Lionel's bicycle was outside, and I thought perhaps he'd... Well, not this. Had you seen Miss Fankel this morning?" "Not since Sunday." Nesta's mouth tightened. She was in a difficult mood. "About the goods yard?" Nesta paused, surprised. She spoke of it after matins. Said she'd been kept out of things that concerned the whole town. Meaning herself. She was set on confronting Teagle and Councillor Garfoot. She thought they'd fixed the consultation in advance. She said she would confront them here in the church. No. She said she'd come early today to put something right. I assumed she meant the notice board. She said the poster was misleading. Misleading how? "It promises an open session," Nesta said, warming to her grievance. but she'd heard certain shopkeepers had already been promised favorable rents. Dora didn't like promises that went round her. Purbright let that rest. Did she mention whom she heard it from? No, she preferred to imply a source rather than name one. Nesta glanced toward the tower. "Do you want Mr. Haxby? He'll be up there." "I'll speak to him," Purbright said. "If you'd wait outside, Sergeant Kiddie will keep things orderly." Nesta went, heels clicking like tidy punctuation. Purbright crossed to the tower stair. The door was ajar. He pushed it and called, "Mr. Haxby." A voice floated down. "In here, Inspector." He climbed the narrow stairs, feeling old grit underfoot. Halfway up he met Harold Haxby coming down, wiping his hands on a rag. Harold was lean, late 50s, and had lived as if the world were slightly deaf. Rope fluff dusted his shoulders. "Terrible thing," Harold said. "I came at 10, like always, and found the west door locked. Lionel wasn't about. I let myself in by the tower and went up. I didn't see Dora." "Did you hear anyone inside?" "No, sir, just pigeons. I assumed folks were late." He swallowed. "Then I heard talk in the square." Purbright asked for Harold's route and whether he'd used the inner door. Harold said he had, unlocking it with his guild key. He held up the key ring, a cheerful bunch that rattled in the stairwell. "You didn't notice Miss Fankel's bicycle? She doesn't ride, does she? She'd have walked, unless she got a lift. Any reason she might have come early besides the poster?" Harold looked uneasy. "There was the matter of the bells themselves." Purbright waited. "We had a note from the diocese. About raising money for repairs. Dora thought it a scandal the guild should run a raffle. She said it was vulgar in church. She meant to speak to the vicar about it." "Today?" "She said she'd catch him before rehearsal. Quietly. She didn't want the others making a pantomime." Purbright's face stayed mild. "Was anyone else upset about the raffle?" Harold shrugged. "Eileen Garfoot wasn't thrilled. But she's not thrilled by anything except her dahlias." "Eileen Garfoot, the councillor's wife. She rings sometimes. Dora took her off the flowers committee last month. There was a bit of frost." Purbright thanked him and sent him down to wait, then lingered in the tower room. The ropes hung in ordered lines, each tail tied off with care. On the small table lay a pair of leather gloves, a thermos cup, and an ashtray holding 2 crushed cigarette ends. Harold did not smoke. Everyone knew that. The ends were fresh, the ash pale. Purbright pocketed one with quiet distaste. He studied the stub a moment, a cheap, filterless thing, crushed as if more from impatience than enjoyment. Not a brand he associated with the guild, who favored mild pipes or nothing at all. It smelt of rain and sharp tobacco, and it had been put out in haste. On the sill a faint smear of mud marked the stone, the print of a narrow heel or slim boot. Someone had stood here, looking down into the church, perhaps listening, perhaps waiting for a bell that never rang. The notion was only a thread, but threads were how Flaxborough came undone. If so, they had left before Lionel arrived, and before Dora could speak. They had smoked, choosing quietly whether to act. Back downstairs, Kitty stood by the west door, holding a lid on boiling water. Through the doorway, Purbright could see Mrs. Hatch speaking urgently to Mrs. Vine, her hands conducting the story into shape. "Sergeant," Purbright said, "bring me the vicar, and find out if Councillor Garfoot or Mr. Teagle have been here this morning." "Yes, sir." Kitty hesitated. "You think it's not just her heart?" Purbright watched the ambulance men lift Dora with respectful clumsiness. "Hearts do fail," he said, "but they usually do so without leaving cigarette ends in bell towers." Kitty blinked, then went. Purbright stepped aside to let the stretcher pass. Dora's folder had been gathered, its papers restacked, but not perfectly. As they went by, a slip of paper fell and fluttered to the floor. Purbright stooped and caught it before any well-meaning shoe found it. It was a torn strip from the goods yard poster, with 3 phone numbers in Dora's neat hand. 2 were crossed through hard. The third was not. Beneath it, she had written, "Ask him before he changes his mind." Purbright folded the strip into his notebook and felt the faintest shift in the day's texture. Someone had been about to change his mind, and Dora had come early to prevent it. Outside, in the square, the town was already deciding what sort of story it was living through. Purbright left the church a few minutes after the ambulance, not because there was nothing more to see, but because in Flaxborough what mattered next was who had seen what. The square had thickened further. Small knots of people arranged themselves to face the west door while maintaining the fiction of errands. Mrs. Vine's broom leaned against her step like a stage prop. Mr. Priddy wiped an already clean window. No one said "murder" aloud, but the word sat among them, well-bred and expectant. Sergeant Kiddy raised a hand. "Make way, please." His tone carried authority wrapped in apology. The groups parted with the reluctant grace of citizens who feel entitled to front-row seats. The vicar approached from the vicarage path, collar gleaming, face composed into pastoral concern. The Reverend Kenneth Grieve was tall, soft-eyed, slightly forgetful in a way that made parishioners want to supply him with lists. Today his breath was faintly quick, as if responsibility were thin air. "Inspector Purbright, I've just heard. Poor Dora. I can hardly—" He stopped, because there are limits to what a man can hardly do in public. "I'm sorry to trouble you, Vicar. May we step inside a moment?" They moved into the porch. The noise of the square softened to a muffled tide. "Did Miss Fankle have an appointment with you this morning?" Purbright asked. "Not precisely. She said on Sunday she wanted a quiet word about the Bell Repairs Fund. I suggested after evensong. She said she would see me sooner, but Dora frequently intended sooner things that never ripened." "Had you seen her today?" "No. I was at the nursing home giving communion at 9:30. I returned just now and found Lionel at the door and everyone gathering." Purbright nodded. "She was also concerned about the goods yard consultation. Did she mention meeting anyone here about it?" Grieve's brows rose, then settled in a little sigh. "Ah, yes, the goods yard. Dora believed certain assurances were being given in advance. She meant to confront Mr. Teagle and Councillor Garfoot. Whether she planned to do it in the church, I can't say. She thought the building lent weight." "Did anyone else know she was coming early?" "She said she'd be in before the bells. That could mean she told half the ladies' society by now." He looked faintly ashamed at the speed in which half might happen. Purbright asked if he had seen anyone smoking in the tower recently. The vicar recoiled at the idea. "Good heavens, no. The guild are strict. I'd smell it from the vestry, and I would have spoken to them." "That's all, thank you." Purbright opened the door for him. Grieve stepped into the square and was immediately absorbed by sympathy and inquiry, like a biscuit dropped into tea. Purbright crossed to the station car, where Lovejoy had arrived, with disapproval on his face. "Cleaners were in at 9, Lovejoy said. "West door locked then, inner door open. They saw no one. Dr. Hurst thinks she died around 9 or a little after." "Any word on Teagle or Garfoot?" "Teagle's at the council offices. Garfoot's still at home. Says he's shocked and coming in at 11 with his wife. Mrs. Garfoot was meant to ring today but didn't show." Purbright slid into the driver's seat. "We'll see Teagle first." He paused, looking back at the church, "and ask for a list of who had tower keys besides the guild." The council offices were in a converted Georgian house behind the library, its front garden clipped as if to reassure the public that nothing radical happened inside. A notice on the gate announced the goods yard scheme in capitals. Purbright entered a hall smelling of varnish and worry. Mr. Reginald Teagle appeared at once, as if he had been waiting behind the door for the sound of boots. He was compact, neat, and had the habit of looking reasonable even while choosing not to be. "Inspector, dreadful business about Dora," he said, mouth whitening politely. "I was just about to ring the vicar." "Were you expecting her this morning?" "No appointment." Teagle's eyes blinked once too long. She has been telephoning lately, as you know, but I had no idea she'd call on me today. She wrote you a letter last night. Purbright watched him over the rim of his notebook. She brought it to the church, sealed. She may have meant to hand it to you there. Teagle stared as though trying to place Dora in the wrong room. At the church? Why would she? That's what I'm here to ask. Purbright's voice remained mild. Miss Fankel noted a phone number and told herself to ask a certain man something before he changed his mind about the scheme. Who is that man? Teagle's smile arrived a moment late. There are many men involved, Inspector. Contractors, surveyors, prospective investors. Dora tended to make a character out of any rumor. Did you speak to her yesterday? Briefly. She wanted to see planning minutes. I told her they were not yet public. And she was displeased. She was Dora, Teagle said, in a tone suggesting that was explanation enough. Purbright's eyes drifted to the ashtray on Teagle's desk. 2 cheap, filterless cigarettes lay there, recently stubbed, their ash still pale. He filed the observation away without comment. May I see the list of people invited to this evening's consultation? He asked. Teagle hesitated just long enough to register the request as faintly improper, then fetched a typed sheet. Purbright read down it with the flat patience of a man scanning hymn numbers. At the bottom, beside one name, a penciled asterisk in Dora's hand had been added. Mr. Alan Crisp, Goods Yard Consortium. Purbright looked up. Your consortium representative. Is Mr. Crisp in town? He stays at the Crown when he visits, Teagle said. He was here yesterday. He may still be. I should like to speak with him, Purbright said quietly, before he changes his mind. Teagle offered a small cough that was meant to be neutral and came out defensive. I'm sure Mr. Crisp will be devastated. He's been most cooperative. Cooperative men are often devastated, Purbright said. They don't always show it in the same place. He returned the list and, after a moment that allowed Teagle to decide whether to volunteer anything else, took his leave. When they were back in the car, Lovejoy said, You noticed the cigarettes? Purbright started the engine. I noticed he didn't offer me one. The ends in the tower were the same kind. They might be. Cheap, sharp tobacco, not the sort Dora would tolerate within 20 yards of a holy building. Lovejoy frowned at the road. So Teagle up there. I've never seen Teagle climb anything without a meeting about it first. They drove to the Crown. The Crown was a low, sprawling pub where visiting salesmen and local committees shook hands under identical pictures of hounds. At midday, it wore that tired respectability pubs adopt when waiting for lunch. The landlord, Mr. Coates, greeted them with the stoic cheer of a man who had once been a sergeant in a different war. Inspector, Sergeant, come to sample the stew? Not today, thank you. Mr. Alan Crisp, staying here. Coates's eyebrows made the smallest parade. That's the consortium fellow. He checked out an hour ago, paid in cash, said he had to get back to Lincoln, took his case and went off on foot with a cigarette stuck to his lip. On foot? Lovejoy repeated. Your lot don't mind folk walking, do they? He said he'd left his car by the river because the square was busy. Purbright let his eyes travel along the bar, noting a damp ring on the wood where a glass had sat recently, and an ashtray pushed half under a beer mat. In it were 3 identical filterless cigarette ends. He say where he was going to walk to? Purbright asked. Station, I expect. Or to find his car, a man having to flee Flaxborough's thrilling hospitality. Coates grinned briefly. He was edgy, mind. Not like yesterday. Yesterday he was all smiles and talk about the future of market towns. Today he looked like he'd lost his appetite. Purbright thanked him, and they left. Outside, the river lay beyond the park. The station was the other way. Between the two stood the goods yard, an uneven stretch of brick sheds and rusted rails that Flaxborough had trained itself not to look at. If Crisp had walked anywhere of consequence, it was there. Purbright drove slowly along the riverside road. Halfway down, they saw a man in a camel coat stepping out of the park gate carrying a suitcase with a thin metal handle. He was lighting a cigarette and doing it badly. The match fluttered in the wind of his own impatience. He looked up as the police car drew level and paused in a manner that made walking by seem suddenly unnecessary. Purbright pulled in neatly to the curb. "Mr. Crisp," he said through the window, then got out without display. Crisp was in his early 40s, clean-shaven, handsome in a blandly official way, and visibly annoyed by being met in the open. His eyes were pale and careful. His smile was a line exercised for public relations. "Inspector Purbright, isn't it? Town clerk said I might run into you. Terribly sorry about Miss Fankel. Shocking for a town like this. How long have you been in Flaxborough?" "Since Sunday evening. Meetings yesterday as scheduled. I was going to take the noon train." His cigarette trembled slightly between finger and thumb. "Is there some formality I can help with?" "A small one." Purbright's voice was as courteous as if asking directions. "Miss Fankel came early to St. Hilda's this morning. She appears to have been expecting to speak to someone about the goods yard. That someone looks to be you." Crisp's smile held, but his eyelids tightened. "I had no appointment with Miss Fankel today." "No, of course not. She was rather fond of unannounced appointments." Crisp laughed too promptly. "It's a local privilege, I expect. But I assure you, Inspector, I didn't see her. I was at the Crown. I had breakfast at 8:30. I checked out at, well, about 11. I'm told you were edgy." "Am I? I had a long drive ahead. And now this news." He glanced at the suitcase as if considering whether to drop it and flee without. "Miss Fankel wasn't a decision-maker. She was a citizen. I was willing to hear citizens this evening, as planned." Purbright nodded, as if satisfied, and then asked mildly, "Do you smoke capstans?" Crisp blinked. "Yes. Why?" "No reason at all." Purbright let the pause do its quiet work. "From your park route, you've been to the goods yard today." Crisp's lips parted. The answer hesitated behind them. "I walked through," he said finally. "To look again. It's difficult to grasp the scale on a map." "At 9 o'clock?" "Earlier, about 9:15. I couldn't sleep." "You went alone?" "Yes." Crisp's face carried the simple impatience of a man finding himself questioned about a harmless habit. "Look, Inspector, if you're suggesting anything untoward, I'd rather you said so plainly. I'm a visiting businessman. I don't lurk about churches killing ladies in hats." "No one suggested you did." Purbright's tone was soothing and therefore, to Crisp, probably more alarming. "But you may have met someone there, or on the way." Crisp shook his head. "No, I saw nobody. A stray dog, perhaps. The yard's deserted." "Deserted things are rarely deserted in daylight," Purbright said. "If Miss Fankel thought you were changing your mind, she might have tried to catch you before rehearsal. She could have come to speak to you at the yard, then come to the church after." "Changing my mind?" Purbright smiled faintly. "You wouldn't be the first man to discover a town is not what its paper makes it." Crisp gave the kind of little snort that can pass for amusement if you don't look too long. "My mind hasn't changed. We're proceeding. This evening I would have said so publicly. Towns need investment. Old goods yards are a blot." Miss Fankel didn't think it a blot. Purbright watched him gently. She thought it a promise that was being broken without her permission. Crisp spread his hands. "Then she misunderstood. I'm sorry she's dead, obvious as that is. But I couldn't even recognize her in the street. I met Teagle, the council, a few traders, that's all." Lovejoy, silent behind Purbright's shoulder, noticed a fresh scratch on Crisp's knuckle. A narrow red line like wire had kissed it. Crisp caught him looking and put the hand casually in his pocket. Purbright said, "Would you be so kind as to come to the station this afternoon? Not under arrest, just to make a fuller statement." Crisp's jaw tightened. "If you insist." "I do," Purbright said, not unkindly. Flaxborough likes its mornings to behave, and when they don't, people become imaginative. Crisp looked toward the river, the yard, the town behind them, as if measuring the distance to any place that might not require politeness. Then he nodded once. "Very well, I'll come. But I hope you'll be quick. I do have a train." Purbright let him walk ahead to the car. As he followed, the inspector's gaze slid briefly to the soles of Crisp's shoes. The right one carried a thin smear of pale mud. Clay, not river silt. The goods yard soil was clay. The church tower sill had clay too. There was no certainty yet, only a repeated texture. Still, in Flaxborough, repeated textures were often the only honest things. They drove back in quiet. Crisp sat in the rear, breathing evenly with the care of a man rehearsing innocence. Lovejoy kept his eyes on the road. Purbright drove as if Sunday lunch depended on his speed, which it did not. At the station, as they stepped inside, Kitty intercepted them carrying a sheaf of notes. "Sir, Mrs. Garfoot and Councillor Garfoot arrived at 11 as promised. She's in a state. He's blustering, and Lionel Spatchcock says he now remembers seeing someone leaving by the side alley just after he found the body. Didn't see the face, heard a car door." Purbright paused, allowing that to align itself with the rest. "A car door at 10:12, he murmured, when everyone else was still on time." Then, to Kitty, "Put the Garfoots in the interview room. Make tea. Tell them I shall be with them shortly, and keep Mr. Crisp comfortable." He turned slightly toward the waiting corridor and felt the town closing in behind its own curtains, every polite face about to sharpen into accusation. Purbright went first to the Garfoots, not because they were most urgent in any abstract sense, but because they were loud, and loudness in a small station spreads like steam. The interview room smelled of tea and official varnish. Councillor Edwin Garfoot sat braced forward, broad hands on his knees. His wife Eileen sat beside him with a damp handkerchief and a hat put on too quickly. "Inspector," Garfoot began before Purbright had shut the door, "this is appalling, and I want to state at once that the council had nothing whatever to do with it." Purbright nodded and took the third chair, setting it slightly away from the table so it felt less like a tribunal. "Miss Fankel believed decisions were being taken without proper consultation. She meant to speak to you." Garfoot's mustache twitched. "Dora believed many things. Dear woman, did a lot for the town, but always sniffing about for scandals. The scheme is straightforward. We're regenerating a derelict site." Eileen made a small, resentful sound. "She was not dear to me," she said, then dabbed her eyes as if surprised to hear herself. "She humiliated me at the society, over a raffle ticket, said I'd miscounted in a manner suggesting bias, in front of everyone. 'Strict people collect enemies,' Purbright said." "She enjoyed it," Eileen muttered. Garfoot patted her wrist with public tenderness. "Half the town's been crossed by Dora at some point, Inspector, but no one would harm her. Certainly not Eileen. She can't watch a chicken with a limp." Purbright looked at Eileen's flushed cheeks and thought she could watch plenty. Aloud he asked, "Were you at St. Hilda's this morning?" "No. I was meant to ring, but I woke with a headache. I told Harold Haxby I'd come if it cleared. Edwin went alone to the offices." "I was at Teagle's by 9:30, Garfoot said, "signing a paper for tonight. There till nearly 10:15. Did you see Miss Fankel on the way?" "No. If I had, I'd have told her to attend the meeting properly. She liked cornering people privately." Purbright asked, "Do you smoke, Councillor?" "Pipe. Not those nasty little things." "And your wife?" "Never." "Either of you in the bell tower recently?" "Good Lord, no." "Lionel Spatchcock remembers a car door in the side alley just after he found her. Anyone you know there around 10:12? "Tradesmen, cleaners. Anyone. That alley's busy. I can give you a list of council keys if it helps." "It may." Purbright stood. "Thank you. I may speak to you again." Outside, Kitty waited. Anything? Not yet, Purbright said, but they're helpfully stocking the motive cupboard. Bring Mr. Crisp in. Alan Crisp entered with his suitcase as if fearing the chairs might confiscate it. Purbright offered him the seat opposite. Lovejoy stood by the door, merely present. Mr. Crisp, you told me you walked the goods yard about 9:15 and saw no one. That's right. You smoke capstans? Yes. Crisp's voice had a clipped edge. Purbright set an ashtray on the table and slid 2 cigarette ends into it. These were in the bell tower. Same brand. Crisp leaned forward. Half the county smokes capstans. Most don't smoke them in church towers. I wasn't in the tower, Crisp said quickly. I didn't even know there was access. I was at the yard. Did you meet Miss Fankel there? No. Or at the church afterward? No. I went back to the Crown, bathed, packed. Purbright glanced at his notes as if changing subject. Your knuckle is scratched. Caught it on a nail. Those sheds are a disgrace. Which shed? The far one by the old platform. Purbright nodded. The cleaners were in St. Hilda's at 9 and saw no one. Lionel arrived around 10:10. Dr. Hurst thinks Miss Fankel died at 9 or shortly after. If she died at the church, someone was with her between 9 and 10. If she died elsewhere and was moved, the mover avoided cleaners, bell ringers, and the vicar. Crisp's jaw tightened. And you think that was me? I think you were the man she wanted to speak to urgently. She wrote your number down with a reminder to ask you something before you changed your mind. She cornered me yesterday, Crisp said, after the traders' walkabout. Said she'd found an old covenant on the yard and meant to stop the scheme. I told her she was mistaken and to bring it to the consultation. She said there might not be a tonight. What did she mean? She said towns make nuisances go away. I thought her melodramatic. He spread his hands. If she died of her heart, it's a tragedy. If she was harmed, it wasn't me. Killing her would wreck the project. Purbright let the words settle. Were you in St. Hilda's yesterday evening? No. The tower sill has clay from the yard. You have clay on your shoe. There's clay on the tower latch. Crisp's color shifted to calculation. I stood on the tower steps last night. Harold Haxby offered to show me the bells, for community relations. We didn't go up far. I smoked later outside. Mud transfers. Harold didn't mention it. He may have forgotten. It meant nothing. I'm a businessman who wants his train. For now, you'll remain in town, Purbright said gently. Sergeant Lovejoy will take a fuller statement. I'd advise you not to go walking alone this afternoon. Crisp opened his mouth, saw Purbright's calm and shut it. When Lovejoy escorted him out, Purbright sat listening to ordinary sounds returning. A typewriter, a kettle, Kitty's shoes. Sir, Lovejoy said from the door. Purbright stood. Bring Harold Haxby back in, and find out whether any covenant on that yard exists. If Dora thought she'd found one, either she had evidence or someone was feeding her stories. Either way, she came early to stop a mind changing. I want to know whose mind and why it needed stopping before the bells. Harold Haxby arrived looking offended at being memorable. He had washed the rope dust from his hands, but it clung to his eyebrows, giving him a constant air of surprise. Purbright offered tea. Harold declined with the solemnity of a man declining brandy. Mr. Haxby, Purbright said, you showed Mr. Crisp the tower last night. Harold's mouth opened a fraction. Oh, yes. He asked about the bells for his remarks tonight. I took him as far as the ringing chamber, not higher. We didn't smoke. You didn't mention that earlier. I didn't think it mattered. You asked if he'd been here this morning. I asked if anyone besides the guild had a tower key. Harold blinked, chastened. No, only us. Lionel, me and the others. The others being. Harold counted them off. Mrs. Nestor Barch, young Webley from the bank. Mrs. Garfoot, when she's fit enough. Mr. Pither, a retired schoolmaster who wore his key on a string round his neck. Did any of them arrive early today? None I saw. Purbright let silence do a little work. Harold shifted in it. 2 capstan cigarette ends were found in the tower, Purbright said. They're not yours. Who smokes among you? Harold's face tightened. Webley smokes sweet cigarillos, though we tell him to wait outside. Peter has a pipe. Nestor never touches the stuff. Eileen Garfoot doesn't smoke, and Lionel detests cigarettes on principle. So someone else was in the tower after you left last night, or before you arrived this morning? Harold frowned. We sometimes get boys up there. Teenagers. They like the view. But the door's always locked. It was locked at 9, Purbright said. Cleaners came through. If anyone entered after, it was with a key or by trick. There's a small stair window, Harold admitted. If you know how to shimmy, you can reach it from the porch roof. Lads have done it before. Lionel had a fit. Thank you, Purbright wrote. Miss Fankel spoke of an old covenant on the goods yard. Did she say anything to you? She asked if I knew the yard history. I said I knew rope history, not railroad. She said she'd found something in parish archives, land held in trust for public benefit and not to be sold without diocesan assent. She was pleased about it, then suddenly worried, like someone had told her she'd misread the label. Who told her? I don't know. She spoke to Teagle, Garfoot, half the ladies' society. She also went round to Mrs. Pither. Mrs. Pither keeps the records, doesn't she? Yes. Dora visited Tuesday afternoon. She came to rehearsal that night in a temper, saying, they'll bury it if I don't act at once. All right, Mr. Hexby. That will do. Harold left. Purbright sat a moment, thinking about windows, roofs, and keys on strings. Then he asked Lovejoy to bring in Mrs. Pither. Mrs. Pither arrived half an hour later in a coat too large and a hat with a black veil she shoved back impatiently. She was 78, neat and durable, and greeted Purbright as if expecting the police to consult her on punctuation. Inspector, it's about Dora. She visited you Tuesday. She did. She took the trust deed from 1899, signed the ledger properly. Then she asked about alterations. I said there were none. The deed is plain. Goods yard land left to the church wardens for public benefit, with a clause on non-alienation without diocesan assent, meaning no sale without permission. Exactly. Dora read that and knew what it meant. Did anyone else read it with her? Mrs. Pither's eyes sharpened. Mr. Teagle arrived while she was there. Tuesday at 4. He said he'd heard Dora had been disturbing old records and wanted to reassure her it was already dealt with. He claimed the diocese had approved a transfer years ago. And you asked to see the approval? I did. He said it was in Lincoln and I shouldn't fret my head over legalities. Dora went very still. Then she said, if it's proper, you won't mind me asking Mr. Crisp directly. Teagle smiled that careful smile and said Mr. Crisp was leaving early and couldn't be bothered before tonight. Dora said she'd see him before he left, diocese or no diocese. Purbright's pen paused. Teagle has access to the archives? He has a key to the cupboard, arrangement with Lionel long ago. I don't like it. He was alone in my front room for 2 minutes while I made tea. I didn't see him take anything, but Dora noticed. She said, he's capable of anything quiet. Purbright thanked Mrs. Pither and walked her out. When she had gone, he returned to his desk and unfolded Dora's torn strip, a phone number and the reminder to ask a man before he changed his mind. If Teagle had told her Crisp was leaving early, her urgency was sensible. She might have tried to catch Crisp at the yard, then come to the church to intercept him again before the bells. Someone had smoked capstans in the tower. Someone had access to keys and archives. Someone wanted that covenant buried. Sergeant, Purbright said to Lovejoy, verify Teagle's movements this morning, and I want the diocesan assent he claims exists. If he can't show it, he's been leaning on an old lady and now a dead one for a reason. Lovejoy nodded. And Mr. Crisp? Keep him close. He may be a nuisance, or he may be the next person the town decides to tidy away. Outside, the town clock struck 1. Flaxborough was resuming lunch with dutiful appetite, already reshaping Dora's death into gossip that felt safe. Purbright listened to the ordinary noises of station life, typewriter, kettle, quiet boots, and felt the case narrowing, not to a name yet, but to a kind of human habit. Somewhere between deeds, bells, and a man's wish to leave before nightfall, the truth was waiting for the right polite question to loosen it and make it speak plainly. Purbright went himself to the council offices after lunch, partly because he liked to see a man in his own habitat, and partly because tea at the station had begun tasting of replay. The Georgian house was quieter now, its morning bustle reduced to the subdued clicking of typewriters and the faint wheeze of radiators that had never forgiven the building for being modernized. Teagle was at his desk with a sandwich that looked as if it had been assembled for a photograph. He rose at once. "Inspector, any further news?" he said with the air of a man who had already decided the proper amount of news. "A little. Mrs. Pither tells me you visited her on Tuesday while Miss Fankel was reading the Goods Yard Trust deed." Teagle's eyes flicked, then steadied. "Yes, I thought it sensible to calm her. Dora could whip herself into a state over a semicolon. Did you show her diocesan assent to a transfer?" I told her it exists." Teagle smiled as if to say that should satisfy anyone with manners. "The papers are in Lincoln. We've always handled such matters through the solicitor." "Which solicitor?" "Lorimer and Vane." Purbright sat without being invited. He took out a small notebook and rested it on his knee, leaving Teagle to decide whether to be offended. "I've rung Lorimer and Vane. They say there is no diocesan assent on file for the Goods Yard land. Not this century, at any rate." Teagle's sandwich paused halfway to his mouth. "Then they've misplaced it." "Possibly. But Mrs. Pither also says you were alone with her records cupboard for 2 minutes. She did not see what you did in those minutes, but Miss Fankel noticed you had them." Teagle put the sandwich down with carefully controlled fingers. "Inspector, you're not suggesting I stole a document from a parishioner's sitting room?" "I'm suggesting Miss Fankel thought you might try. She wrote your name with a steel pen in her complaint. She also noted Mr. Crisp would be leaving early and wished to catch him before he did." Teagle's voice cooled by a degree. "Mr. Crisp is an investor. He had nothing to do with the parish deed. Even if he did, surely this is a civil matter. It scarcely explains a death. Unless someone feared the civil matter would become a criminal one." Teagle gave a small, impatient laugh. "What criminal one? The council is entitled to develop derelict land. The diocese has no interest in old sidings." Purbright looked past him to the filing cabinet, where an open drawer displayed neat buff folders and, on top, an envelope in Dora's handwriting. Teagle followed his gaze and shut the drawer a little too quickly. "You received Dora's letter?" "Mrs. Hatch brought it over when you removed her body." Teagle's tone went briskly administrative. "I haven't read it. I thought it best to hand it to you." He could have done that already, Purbright thought, and said only, "May I see it?" Teagle retrieved the envelope. It had been opened and resealed with a careful lick that hadn't quite matched Dora's neatness. Purbright did not remark on that either. He slid the letter out, skimmed it, and found it as he remembered. A demand for an emergency subcommittee and a request that Crisp be seen before he departed. At the bottom, Dora had added a postscript. If the assent cannot be produced, the matter becomes one for the constabulary. "Were you with Lionel Spatchcock this morning?" Purbright asked. "No, I was here by 9:30. Garfoot came at 9:40. We worked through budget slips. Ask him." "Intend to. Did you leave at all between 9 and 10? Teagle spread his hands. "No, I had 2 clerks in and out. I make tea. I breathe. That is all." Purbright nodded, then said almost lazily, "Do you smoke capstans, Mr. Teagle?" Teagle blinked. "Occasionally, when I'm obliged." "Why?" "Because 2 capstan ends were in the bell tower. Fresh, And one in the ashtray you use? Cigarettes travel with their owners. Teagle's jaw set. Are you suggesting I climbed St. Hilda's Tower and smoked there? I'm suggesting you may have been there at some point. Perhaps yesterday evening, perhaps this morning. Miss Fankel may have met you in the porch. She may have told you she'd speak to Crisp and the police, and you may have thought of a quiet way to prevent that. Teagle's nostrils flared. For a moment he seemed about to erupt, and then his training returned like a tight collar. This is grotesque, he said softly. Dora was a nuisance, but she was one of ours. I would not harm her, and I certainly would not do so in church. If you require my movements, you may check them with anyone here. But I will not be accused based on cigarette litter and parish gossip. Purbright closed his notebook. Thank you. I will check. You may also like to find that diocesan assent. It will ease everyone's afternoon. He rose, and Teagle rose too, a shade too close. As Purbright reached the door, he noted, without turning, the scent of sharp tobacco on Teagle's sleeve and a faint reddening at the knuckle of his right hand, as if it had been grazed on wire. Small things, but small things were the town's true handwriting. Outside, the square was thinning as people returned to work, but their eyes followed him with the delicate hunger of spectators who had paid for a show. A boy on a bicycle shot past with a newspaper tucked under his arm, the headline already inventing motive. Purbright walked back to the car slowly. Before he drove away, he turned once more to St. Hilda's Tower rising above the rooftops. It stood solid, indifferent, and amused. Somewhere inside it, someone had waited with a cigarette, listening for footsteps. Purbright found Councillor Garfoot at the Civic Hall at 3 o'clock, false energetic among trestle tables and pamphlets. The consultation banners had been hung with a zeal that suggested redemption by bunting. Volunteers were laying out chairs in rows that never quite aligned, and the smell of fresh paint mingled with tea-urns warming in the corner. Garfoot brightened as if greeted by a camera. "Inspector, I hope you're bringing reassurance. The town's on needles." "I've come for accuracy," Purbright said. "You were at Teagle's office between 9:40 and 10:15. "Correct. With him the whole time. We conferred. Signed minutes. You can ask Miss Harbottle. She brought in the figures." "Did Teagle leave the room?" "Only to make tea. A man is allowed tea." Purbright nodded. "Did you bring your car into the side alley by St. Hilda's around 10:12? Garfoot stared. "Absolutely not. I'd no reason to be there. Besides, my car was at the office car park. Lionel heard a car door there. Well, Lionel hears cows coughing and calls it a commotion." Garfoot's eyes narrowed, then softened into civic regret. "Dora's death has people saying wild things. I'd appreciate you letting them know it was natural." "The doctor is not yet certain," Purbright said mildly. "One more thing. Did you ever see diocesan assent for transfer of the goods yard land?" Garfoot waved a hand. "Teagle said it was all in order. We don't go prodding church paperwork. You'd be there until you died of boredom. Look, Inspector, if a deed from 1899 is holding this town ransom, the diocese can approve now. We're not criminals." "No," Purbright agreed, "just in a hurry." Garfoot did not like that. Hurry is how you prevent decay. Dora was fond of decay as long as she could supervise it. As Purbright left the hall, a voice called his name from the steps. Miss Harbottle, Teagle's senior clerk, stood with a carton of leaflets in her arms. She was young enough to have opinions and old enough to hide them at work. "Inspector," she said, lowering her voice, "I'm not sure if I should bother you, but Mr. Teagle asked me this morning to ring Lincoln for a copy of an approval letter. I said we didn't have one. He said to ring anyway and say it was urgent. I did. They said no such approval existed." "Did he seem surprised?" "He seemed angry. Not at them, at me. He said, 'If Miss Fankel turns this into a circus, I'll have your head on a plate.' I thought he was joking. He wasn't smiling." Purbright thanked her, and as she hurried inside, he watched her shoulders settle as if released from a weight. Back at the station, Lovejoy was waiting with a message. "Sir, Dr. Hurst has the preliminary post-mortem. Dora Fankel did not die of a heart attack. She was poisoned, digitalis most likely, in a dose high enough to stop the heart clean." Purbright absorbed that without outward change, as if a suspicion had finally sat down. "Did she have digitalis prescribed?" "Empty bottle in her handbag, but Hurst says her prescription was for a mild tonic, not digitalis, and there's a puncture mark on her upper arm. Injection. So someone met her close enough to be kind." Lovejoy nodded. "He wants a full inquest." "Of course." Purbright took off his hat and set it on the corner of the desk. The room seemed smaller now that the death had a hand behind it. "Notify Teagle and Garfoot that this is murder, and keep Mr. Crisp under our roof tonight." Kitty came in behind Lovejoy, carrying another small fact. "Found something at the yard, sir? A syringe wrapper in the far shed by the platform, fresh, and boot prints in the clay leading from the shed toward the river path." Purbright closed his eyes for a second, then opened them, patient. "Any idea of size?" "Smallish. Narrow heel, like a woman's boot. Could be anyone, though." "The shed," Crisp mentioned. "Yes, sir." Purbright walked to the window. The afternoon light slanted across the square where people were scarfing their last errands before the evening meeting. They still believed, for another hour or two, that Dora had simply fallen. Their faces would change when told otherwise. People in Flaxborough loved a natural death, but murder required them to take sides. He said to Lovejoy, "Go to the Crown and see who left early this morning besides Crisp. Find out if anyone ordered digitalis from the chemist lately, and ask Dr. Hurst to list patients with access to it." "Yes, sir." "Kitty, bring in Mrs. Nesta Barch again, and Mr. Pither. I want to know who could have climbed that porch roof and who might have been waiting in the tower." Kitty went. Alone, Purbright took Dora's letter from his file and read the postscript once more. She had threatened to make the matter one for the constabulary. She had written it the night before, perhaps after Teagle's visit to Mrs. Pither. She had come early to catch Crisp, or Teagle, or whoever had told her a mind was changing. She had been met instead by someone who offered help, a needle, and a quiet solution. The bells at St. Hilda's began to rehearse at 4:30, delayed but not silenced. The sound floated through the open window into the station, orderly, solemn, refusing to admit that a woman had died before they rang. Purbright listened, and in the cadence of the changes he heard the town's stubborn will to continue as if nothing were wrong. It was a comforting hypocrisy. It also meant the killer had expected normality to cover a small, precise crime. He picked up his hat and stood. The next hour would not be ordinary for anyone, and he intended to keep it that way. Outside, the square was already lifting its chin toward evening, and Purbright, politely relentless, stepped into it to see who flinched there first. Purbright returned to the station as Kitty ushered Nesta Barch in. She carried indignation like sheet music and sat with her gloves folded. Mr. Pither followed, thin shoulders hunched, his keystring visible against his cardigan. "You've heard Dr. Hurst's finding," Purbright said. Nesta's mouth tightened. The square has been rehearsing it already. "It was poisoning," Purbright went on, "by injection. Digitalis. Miss Fankel was met in or near St. Hilda's between 9 and 10. Someone had a syringe, a dose, and enough composure to act quietly. I'd like to know who could have been in the tower or on the porch roof this morning." "No one from the guild," Nesta said at once. "We were all at home until rehearsal." "Can you account for yourself?" "I was in my kitchen at 9:30, making stock. My husband will say so. At 10 I walked to choir practice and reached the church at 10:20. Lionel told you that." Purbright nodded. "Did you go up to the ringing chamber yesterday evening?" "No, I don't climb those stairs unless I must." Mr. Pither cleared his throat. "I was at home too. I read the Times until 9:30, then met Mr. Webley in the Crown Garden. I left at 10 for rehearsal and found the door locked. You smoke? A pipe?" "Never in church." We found capstan ends in the tower, Purbright said. Fresh, and a narrow-heeled boot print on the sill. Not ours, Nesta said, genuinely revolted. Mr. Pither blinked. I wear brogues, Inspector. So do I, Purbright said mildly. Miss Fankle spoke of meeting someone before the bells. Did she mention who? She said someone offered her a private assurance if she'd stop making trouble over the goods yard, Nesta replied. She wouldn't name them. If you want a pond, Inspector, try the council one. Mr. Teagle's been snapping at everyone for weeks. Purbright thanked them and let them go. When the door shut, Kitty reappeared with Lovejoy returning from the Crown, rein on his collar, and a notebook in his hand. Crisp was the only guest who checked out, Lovejoy said, but a woman left early too. Mrs. Eileen Garfoot. She came in alone at 7, asked after Crisp, waited in the lounge, and smoked 2 capstans in the garden. Coates saw her leave at 8:45 in her blue Morris, driving toward the river. Kitty whistled low. She told us she was home with a headache. The chemist? Purbright asked. Lovejoy flipped a page. Miss Larkins sold Digitalis tablets on Friday to Councillor Garfoot. He said they were for his wife's circulation. Eileen's on no prescription list. Dora was in the shop at the time and remarked, "You'll be dosing a cow next." Garfoot laughed and paid cash. Tablets could be crushed and dissolved. Purbright walked to the map above his desk. The route from the Crown to the goods yard ran by the river path and past St. Hilda's side alley. If Eileen left at 8:45, she could reach the yard before 9, meet Dora there, then be in the tower to watch for arrivals. The syringe wrapper in the far shed made the sequence feel indecently neat. "Bring Mrs. Garfoot in," Purbright said, with kindness, "and send for Garfoot as well. I want them together." They arrived at 5:30, just as the consultation hall was filling. Garfoot looked affronted to be detained on a civic evening. Eileen looked pale, her earlier flush replaced by careful stillness. She set her handbag upright and kept her hands on it as if it were a hymn book. Purbright told them quietly what he knew. The Crown, the capstans, the Digitalis purchase, the wrapper at the yard, the boot print in the tower. Eileen's eyes widened at the mention of the Crown. Garfoot swung toward her. "You went there this morning," he barked. "I went for air," she said too quickly. "I couldn't bear the house. I needed to speak to Mr. Crisp, to ask him to delay tonight. Dora was threatening to stop everything." Purbright watched her. "Did you meet Miss Fankle at the goods yard?" "She was there," Eileen whispered. "She came out of the far shed waving that deed. She said Edwin had bribed the diocese, that she'd call the police. I told her she was wrong. She laughed. She said I was a silly garden ornament. And then?" Eileen's fingers crushed the clasp. "I had tablets in my pocket, not for my heart, just because Edwin bought them and said they might help me. I'd taken one before, and it made me feel steady. I told Dora I felt faint and asked her to help me to the church porch. She did. In the porch, I said an injection would calm me faster. She didn't question it. I had a syringe from the yard office. Mr. Crisp's people left a first aid box there yesterday. I dissolved the tablet, filled the syringe, and jabbed her. She..." Garfoot stared at his wife as if she had altered shape. "You killed her? Over a raffle ticket?" "Over being laughed at for 20 years, Eileen said, her voice flat with exhaustion. "Over knowing she'd make you small too. I didn't set out to kill her. I just couldn't bear her eyes any longer." Purbright let the silence settle before he said softly, "Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Garfoot. Sergeant, take her to the cells. We'll proceed properly." Garfoot made a sound that was half prayer, half anger, and sank into his chair. Kitty led Eileen out, gentle but firm. From the window came the murmur of voices gathering for the evening meeting, unaware its keynote had changed. Purbright picked up Dora's torn note once more, then set it away. Outside, the bells began again, and under them he heard a town's careful illusions fail. Purbright did not go to the consultation hall that evening. He could have, and in another town an inspector might have made a great show of it, arriving with a confession in his pocket and a culprit in custody, letting the public taste justice like a mouthful of strong tea. But Flaxborough disliked public tastes of anything too strong. It preferred its moral shocks taken privately, behind net curtains, and then discussed as if they were someone else's fault. Instead, Purbright stayed at the station while the town assembled under Civic Hall bunting and waited for a future that had already been postponed. Councillor Garfoot sat in the interview room for a long time after his wife was taken away, his broad shoulders gradually shrinking under a weight he had never known he was carrying. Once, he had blustered about ransom and regeneration and the impatient goodness of progress. Now he stared at the varnished tabletop as if it were a pond in which his own face had begun to dissolve. Purbright returned after arranging the formalities. He did not sit immediately. He poured tea with the careful domesticity of a man who understood that people think more plainly when their hands are occupied by something ordinary. "I can't understand it," Garfoot said at last. His voice was hoarse, and the familiar mustache had lost its civic bravado. "Eileen's always been sharp in her way, but nothing like this." Purbright stirred his tea slowly. "She has been sharp for a long time without anyone noticing. That is not a comfortable kind of sharpness." She says Dora laughed at her. But Dora laughed at half the town. We all carried on. "Yes," Purbright said. "Some people carry on like suitcases. Others carry on like sand in a shoe." Garfoot's hands trembled. "I bought the tablets because she'd been tired. I thought I was helping. I never imagined she'd—" "You didn't imagine, Councillor, because you're a man who expects the world to behave. It often does, until it doesn't. Then it's too late to be surprised that people were hurting quietly." Garfoot looked up, the old politician surfacing for a moment. "You said earlier you didn't know it was murder. When did you know?" Purbright was silent a beat, letting honesty arrive without flourish. "When the small things wouldn't sit still. The cigarette ends in the tower, not because cigarettes are rare, but because smoking there meant someone had been waiting. The clay by the sill and on Mr. Crisp's shoe. Not because clay proves a route, but because it repeated itself. Your wife saying she had a headache and stayed home, while a man saw her leave the Crown early, smoking the same cheap tobacco. And Dora's note about catching someone before he changed his mind. She was hurrying that morning, and in Flaxborough, when a woman like Dora hurries, it is because she believes something decent is about to be quietly undone." Garfoot swallowed. "We were going to handle the deed later, with the diocese. Teagle said it would be smoothed. Dora would have made a spectacle." "Teagle tried to smooth it by removing it," Purbright said gently. "He frightened Mrs. Pither and lied about a cent. Dora was right to think she needed to act quickly. She thought a business mind might change at the last minute and save the yard from a dubious transfer. She didn't see that the mind she needed to worry about was your wife's, and that it had already changed into something darker." Garfoot pressed his fingers to his eyes, then dropped them. "So Teagle was dishonest, not murderous. Dishonesty is common enough to make itself look like murder in a hurry, but his lies built the pressure chamber in which your wife found a way to break. He had tried to keep Dora quiet. Eileen tried to keep Dora silent. And Mr. Crisp? A visitor caught in a local storm. He may be relieved, or he may be disgusted. Either way, he was not the one Dora died to stop. She died because she tried to stop everyone at once." Garfoot made a sound that might have been a laugh if his throat had agreed. "She would have liked that phrasing." "Yes," Purbright said, and there was the faintest dry warmth in it. "She had a talent for expanding a matter until it was larger than the people inside it. She thought she was protecting Flaxborough's rights. She didn't realize she was also scratching at Flaxborough's pride." The councillor stared at him as if searching for condemnation and finding only understanding, which in its way felt worse. "What happens now?" he asked. Now the inquest will take its course. Mrs. Garfoot will be charged with murder. You will be asked things you won't want to answer. The town will talk. Then it will grow tired of talking and start rearranging the story into something it can live with. Garfoot seemed to fold inward. And the goods yard? That, Purbright said, will have to wait for honest papers. When Garfoot had gone, with Lovejoy guiding him politely to the door, because even wrecked councillors are still councillors, Purbright went to the outer room where the station lamps threw a low, kindly light. Kiddy was at his desk, trying not to look as relieved as he felt. Lovejoy wrote in careful lines, his expression the particular blend of satisfaction and regret that came with a confession properly obtained. "Sir," Lovejoy said quietly, "do you think she meant to kill Dora?" Purbright loosened his collar, considered the question as if it were a knot in a rope. She meant to stop her. She used a thing she had only half understood because she wanted a quicker, tidier outcome than an argument would give her. She did not picture death until Dora went quiet. Then she did what Flaxborough has trained itself to do. She tried to make the disturbance disappear. By moving her into the vestibule. Yes, a respectable place for a death she couldn't bear to own. She left her there before the cleaners came through again. Then she went to the tower, waited, smoked, and listened. She thought if she knew who arrived first, she could shape the story before it got away. Kiddy shook his head slowly. All that because Dora took her off a committee. Not exactly, Purbright said. Because Dora made her feel small, and because Eileen had been small too long. Committees are seldom about committees. They're about who gets to look straight forward in public and who doesn't. Lovejoy hesitated. The town won't like it, sir. The town won't change, Purbright replied. It will pretend to, for a month or two. It will whisper about Eileen's temper, Edwin's blindness, Teagle's arrogance, and Dora's mouth. It will say the goods yard was cursed, that the church steps are unlucky, that something in the river air turns women's hearts. Monsieur Deville, that will be a way of not saying what actually happened. That a decent woman felt humiliated, found a chance to strike back, and did so before the bells rang. Outside, the bell rehearsal ended with its final clean chord. The sound hung in the night like a lid being closed. A few days later, Flaxborough attempted to resume itself. The market ran on Friday as if no one had ever died on stone tiles. Mrs. Vine swept her step with a ferocity that suggested moral hygiene. Mr. Priddy's shutters clapped at their usual hour, and everyone flinched privately at how stable the noise was. In the Crown, people drank and lamented and agreed, in broad strokes, that it was a shame and terribly sad, and who would have thought? They avoided one another's eyes when the subject went dangerously near their own kitchens. St. Hilda's porch was scrubbed, but the faint mark where Dora had fallen persisted like a memory someone had tried to rub out too quickly. The Bell Ringers Guild held its raffle anyway, but Nesta Barch insisted the tickets be sold outside in the cold, as if to reassure God that it had only ever been about roof slates. Harold Haxby kept his key more closely hidden, and Mr. Pither waited a moment longer before answering whenever his telephone rang. The goods yard scheme stalled. Teagle produced no assent, and in the lull that followed, the diocese arrived with polite inquiries and a quiet demand for proper process. The consortium withdrew pending review, which was a phrase that let everyone save face at once. Alan Crisp left Flaxborough without taking the train, driving instead in his own car by a road that didn't pass the church and never returned. He sent a short letter of sympathy to the vicar and a longer one to his head office, in which Flaxborough became a cautionary footnote. Teagle remained town clerk, because towns like Flaxborough do not expel their mistakes so much as reshelve them where they will not be seen. Yet his tone fell by a notch when addressing elderly parishioners, and when he passed Purbright in the square, he touched his hat with a sudden, faint humility that looked like a new muscle. He did not smoke in public again. Purbright filed the case on a Thursday afternoon. The report was neat, unemphatic, and contained no adjectives that would have startled a committee. When he had finished, he sat for a moment, listening to the station's ordinary quiet. It was a comfort and a warning. Towns behave because people pretend they will. The pretending does useful work, right up until it doesn't. He went out into the corridor to give Lovejoy a note. There was nothing heroic in the gesture. It was only paperwork, returning to its proper stack. "Sir," Lovejoy asked, "will you be at the inquest?" "I expect so." "And after?" Purbright looked briefly through the station window at the square, where life moved in careful loops. "After," he said, "Flaxborough will go on. It always does. We see what we can, and we let the rest settle into the habits that keep roofs from leaking and hearts from bursting on stairwells. That is most of police work, if we're honest." He put on his hat, as he always did before leaving a room, and stepped out into the afternoon that behaved again only because everyone needed it to.